If you're so smart, translate this. The businessman laughed at the farmer and Sarah Harrison, gripped her straw hat tightly in her hands as she tried to stay calm in front of the man in a suit who was laughing loudly in the conference room. The businessman, Grant Sterling, pointed his finger at her with a look of pure scorn, as if he had just heard the funniest joke of his life. "You really think you can understand international contracts?" said Grant, still laughing. "Ma'am, you probably can barely read, let alone understand technical English." Sarah felt her face burn with anger, but she took a deep breath. She had come here to defend her family's land, which was at risk of being sold to a foreign company. What she didn't expect was to be treated like an ignorant person just because of her simple clothes and rural background. "I understand very well what is written in that contract," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "Oh, really?" Grant picked up a sheet of paper from the table and waved it in the air. "Then since you're so smart, translate this." He threw the paper in front of her with disdain. Sarah looked at the document full of English terms and felt a knot in her stomach. It wasn't just a simple contract. It was something far more complicated than she had imagined. "You can start whenever you want," said Grant, crossing his arms and leaning back in his leather chair. "I'm waiting." Sarah looked around the luxurious room. The glass walls offered a view of downtown Sacramento, a city 2 hours away from her small property in Asheville. She had made this trip by bus, spending money she barely had, because she knew it was her only chance to save the land where she was born and raised. 3 weeks earlier, a man had shown up at her farm with an offer that seemed too good to be true. He offered a large sum for her land, claiming that an American company wanted to set up a factory in the area. Sarah was suspicious right away. Her property was small and had nothing special to justify such interest. That's when she discovered she wasn't the only one. 7 other neighbors had also received similar offers. All the plots were in a specific area, forming a large block of land. That couldn't be a coincidence. Sarah started investigating on her own. She discovered that behind the supposed American company was Sterling Construction and Partners, owned by Grant Sterling. He was buying the land for a fraction of its real value, only to resell it to a logistics company that would build a giant distribution center. Now she was here, trying to talk directly to him, but Grant had made it clear from the very first minute that he didn't take her seriously. To him, she was just an ignorant hillbilly who didn't understand business. "You're taking too long," said Grant, looking at his watch. "Maybe it's better for you to go back to your cows and let the adults handle serious business." Sarah tightened her grip on the hat even more. Those words hurt more than they should. Her whole life, she had fought against this kind of prejudice. As the daughter of small farmers, she had always been underestimated because of her humble background. But Sarah had a secret that Grant knew nothing about. She had studied linguistics at the State University through a program for children of rural producers. For 4 years, she balanced her studies with work on the farm, waking up at 4 in the morning to milk the cows before catching the bus to college. Her parents never understood why she wanted to study so much, but they supported her even without comprehension. During the course, Sarah specialized in translation and even did a 6-month exchange program in the United Kingdom, funded by a scholarship she earned thanks to her excellent grades. There she perfected her English and learned about international contracts by working part-time at a law firm. When she returned to Brazil, she tried working in the big city, but her longing for rural life spoke louder. She decided to stay on the farm and help her parents, temporarily setting aside her career as a translator. That's when her father suffered a heart attack 2 years ago, and she fully took over the property. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. That really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Grant drummed his fingers on the table, clearly impatient. His dark eyes had an expression of superiority that Sarah knew well. It was the same look she got every time she had to go to the bank or talk to suppliers in the city. People saw her simple clothes and automatically assumed she was ignorant. "Look," said Grant, standing up from his chair, "I have an important meeting in 15 minutes. If you can't even read the first line, I think you'd better sign the papers and leave. I'm being generous with the offer." "I didn't come here to sell anything," Sarah replied, finally lifting her eyes from the document. I came here to understand why you are cheating my neighbors. The smile immediately left Grant's face. What do you mean, cheating? You're offering $60,000 for properties worth at least $200,000 each, and you're using a shell company to hide your true intent. Grant gave a nervous laugh. You're delusional. Those lands aren't worth even half of what I'm offering. They're rural properties with no commercial potential. That's not what the construction project for the Continental Logistics Hub says, said Sarah, pulling a folder out of her simple bag. I got a copy from City Hall. Very interesting how the chosen land coincides exactly with the properties you're trying to buy. Grant's face turned red with anger. Where did you get that? It doesn't matter where I got it. What matters is that now I know your game. Grant stepped closer to the table, placing both palms flat on it and leaning towards Sarah. Listen here, you stuck-up hick. You don't know who you're messing with. My family has been building in this region for 3 generations. I have contacts everywhere. If you try to interfere, you'll regret it bitterly. Sarah didn't back down. She sat still, looking him straight in the eye. You can threaten me all you want, but I won't let you cheat my family and my neighbors. Your family? Grant laughed out loud. From what I know, you live alone on that miserable property. Your parents are gone and you have no one to help you. You're a lone woman trying to act smart. Those words hit Sarah hard. It was true that she'd been alone since her parents passed. Her father had a sudden heart attack 2 years ago, and her mother, who never recovered from the loss, also left only 6 months later due to heart complications. Sarah was left with the farm and a considerable debt at the bank. Grant realized he had touched a sensitive spot and took advantage. You know how much you owe the bank, don't you? $45,000. With my offer, you can pay it all off and still have money left. If you refuse, you'll lose everything anyway in a few months. Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. It was true. The debt was growing, and she could barely pay the interest with the income from her small milk and cheese production. But she knew selling for that paltry price would be an even bigger mistake. Still, I'm not selling. Then you're dumber than I thought, said Grant, returning to his chair. But let me make you another offer. If you're really as smart as you think, translate this contract right here in front of me. If you can, I'll double my offer for all the properties. If you can't, you sign the sale right now for my original offer. Sarah looked at the document. It was 10 pages of technical terms in legal English. It wasn't impossible, but it would be quite a challenge, especially under pressure. And if I can translate it, if you can, which I seriously doubt, I'll not only double the offer, I'll completely drop the project. But if you mess up a single word, you sign everything now. Sarah knew it was a trap. Grant wouldn't make a bet like that unless he was sure she'd lose. But she also knew it was her only chance to save not just her own property, but her neighbors too. Fine, Sarah said. I accept. Grant smiled with satisfaction and called his secretary. Brenda, cancel my next meeting and call Arthur in here as a witness. While they waited, Sarah examined the document more closely. It was truly complicated. It was a joint venture contract between a Brazilian company and an American one, with specific clauses about profit distribution, environmental liabilities, and dispute resolution. Many terms were specific to international business law. Arthur, who appeared to be the company's lawyer, entered the room a few minutes later. He was a man in his 50s, with glasses and a serious expression. Arthur, be a witness to this agreement, Grant said. This lady claims she can translate international contracts. If she can, I'll drop the rural land project in Asheville. If she can't, she sells her property right now. Arthur looked at Sarah with a pitying expression, as if it were obvious she was walking into her own failure. Mr. Grant, maybe you should reconsider. This contract has very specific terms of international law. No, Grant said, clearly confident. She wanted to play smart. Now she'll see what happens when she meddles with things she doesn't understand. Sarah took the document and began to read. The first lines were about the parties involved in the contract. She could translate that without issue, but she knew the more complex clauses were coming. You may begin, Grant said, leaning back in his chair with a triumphant air. This joint venture agreement is entered into between Green Valley Corp., a company incorporated under the laws of the state of Delaware, United States. Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. Grant lost a bit of his smile. She had translated perfectly so far. And Sterling Agro-Industrial Ltd., a Brazilian limited liability company, headquartered in the city of Sacramento, state of Chicago, for the joint development of a logistics distribution center project in the mountainous region of Chicago. Arthur looked at Grant in surprise. The translation was perfect. Sarah continued page after page, translating complex terms about responsibility distribution, investment percentages, exit clauses, and penalties for non-compliance. Her voice remained steady, even when she reached very technical expressions. Grant began to get nervous. He clearly hadn't expected her to get this far. The parties agree that any dispute arising from this agreement shall be resolved through international arbitration in accordance with the rules of the International Chamber of Commerce, headquartered in Paris, France, Sarah continued. When she reached the 7th page, she found a clause that made her pause for a few seconds. It was about environmental impact and specific liabilities in the event of ecological damage. The terms were extremely technical and included concepts of international environmental law that she wasn't sure how to translate accurately. "Having some trouble?" Grant asked, regaining confidence. Sarah took a deep breath. She knew she was reaching the hardest part, but she also noticed something strange in that clause. There was a contradiction between two sections of the text that made no sense from a legal standpoint. In the event of adverse environmental impact resulting from the distribution center's operations, Green Valley Corp assumes full responsibility for remediation costs, limited to a maximum of $5 million. However, Sarah paused again. "However what?" Grant insisted. "However, there's something odd here. This clause contradicts itself. In the first part, it says the American company assumes full responsibility, but 2 pages later, it states that the costs are the Brazilian company's responsibility." Arthur approached and looked at the document. "Can you show me where you see that contradiction?" Sarah pointed out the 2 sections. Arthur read carefully and went pale. "Mr. Grant, she's right. There's a serious contradiction here. If this contract were signed as is, we'd assume all environmental risks while they only keep the profits." Grant snatched the document from Arthur's hands. "That's impossible. This contract was reviewed by the best lawyers in Chicago." "Maybe they should have hired someone who actually understands international contracts," Sarah said, with a hint of irony in her voice. Grant's expression changed completely. For the first time, he was looking at Sarah with something resembling respect, mixed with a lot of anger. "How did you notice that?" "Because I really do know how to read international contracts. I worked for 6 months at a law firm in the United Kingdom, reviewing exactly this kind of document. The silence in the room was absolute. Grant was clearly processing the fact that he had completely underestimated Sarah. "You're not done with the translation yet," he said, trying to regain some control of the situation. "That's true," Sarah agreed. "But I think I've already made my point." She continued translating the remaining pages, including a section on technology transfer and another on territorial exclusivity. When she finished, 25 minutes had passed. Arthur was clearly impressed. "The translation is perfect, better than many I've seen from professional translators in the city." Grant was visibly annoyed, but he knew he had lost the bet. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "You won. I give up on the land project." "Not so fast," Sarah said. "I want that in writing. And I want you personally to go to each of my neighbors and explain that you've withdrawn the offer." "That's humiliating." "No more humiliating than being called ignorant and a hick by someone who can't even review his own contracts properly." Grant took a deep breath, clearly swallowing his wounded pride. "Fine. Arthur, prepare a document formalizing my withdrawal from the project." But Sarah knew this victory was just the beginning of her problems. Grant wasn't the kind of man who would accept defeat easily, and she still had the issue of the bank debt to sort out. While Arthur prepared the documents, Sarah took the opportunity to look more closely at the contract she had translated. Something still bothered her. Why would Grant have such a complex contract if his intention was just to buy small rural properties? When she read the section on territorial exclusivity more carefully, she understood. The project wasn't just an ordinary distribution center. It was part of a much bigger plan to transform the entire mountain region into a logistics zone, connecting the port of Savannah to the interior of West Virginia. The lands he wanted to buy weren't just for building a warehouse. They were to control a strategic route that would be worth tens of millions of dollars in the future. "Mr. Grant," Sarah said, "may I ask a question?" "What?" "Why weren't you honest from the start? If you'd offered a fair price for the land and explained the real potential of the project, maybe you could have convinced my neighbors without having to deceive anyone." Grant looked at her with an expression Sarah couldn't read. "Because, my dear, honesty is a luxury that anyone trying to make money can't afford. You may have beaten me today, but you're still a naive idealist. The real world doesn't work with nice people." "Maybe the world would work better if it did," Sarah replied. Arthur came back with the printed documents. Grant signed reluctantly, but he signed. "There," he said, tossing the pen onto the table. "Satisfied?" "For now." Sarah put her copy of the documents in her purse and stood up to leave. When she reached the door, Grant called out, "Hey, Sarah." She turned around. "You may have won this time, but your debt to the bank is still there, and I know the manager. One word from me, and they can accelerate the collections." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't let it show. "You do what you think is best. I know a few people, too." It was a lie. Sarah didn't know anyone influential, but Grant didn't need to know that. Leaving the commercial building, Sarah felt a mix of relief and worry. She had managed to protect her neighbor's land, but her own situation remained complicated, and she was sure Grant wouldn't let things rest there. The bus back to Asheville only left in 2 hours. Sarah decided to use that time to think about her next strategy. She went to a nearby diner and ordered a coffee. While stirring the sugar, her mind worked on the next steps. The debt to the bank was real and urgent. She had 2 months until the final deadline. If she couldn't find a way to pay it off or renegotiate it, she would lose everything anyway. Today's translation job had been a moral victory, but it didn't solve her financial problems. That's when she remembered something she had seen in Grant's contract. A clause mentioned that Green Valley Corp was looking for local partners to provide translation services during the project implementation phase. Since the project still existed, it had only changed location. Maybe there was an opportunity there. Sarah picked up her phone and called the only person she knew who could help her, Professor Eleanor, her former advisor at college. Eleanor had become the director of the linguistics department and kept in touch with several companies that needed translation services. "Sarah, what a surprise," said Eleanor. "How are things on the farm?" "Complicated, Professor. I really need some advice." Sarah briefly told her about the situation. Eleanor listened carefully. "You know, I've always said you should go back to professional translation. You have too much talent to be hidden away on a farm." "I know, Professor, but right now I don't have a choice. I need to find a way to make money quickly. Let me make a few calls. I have a contact at an American company that's expanding operations in Brazil. They're always in need of translators specialized in international contracts." "That would be amazing. But there's a condition. You'd have to move to Chicago. The job is in person." Sarah felt her heart tighten. Leaving the farm meant abandoning everything she had fought for, but it also meant a chance to start over. "Let me think about it, Professor." "Of course, but don't take too long. These opportunities appear quickly and disappear just as fast." When she hung up the phone, Sarah was more confused than before. She had a possible solution to her financial problems, but it required sacrificing exactly what she was trying to save. The phone rang. It was Mr. Arthur, her nearest neighbor, a 70-year-old man who took care of his small property alone. "Sarah, girl, are you okay? I heard you went to talk to that businessman from the city." "I'm fine, Mr. Arthur. I managed to get him to give up buying our land." "What do you mean?" He seemed very determined. Sarah briefly explained what had happened. Mr. Arthur was impressed. "Girl, you've always been smart, but this was incredible. How did you learn to speak English like that?" "I studied at university, Mr. Arthur. I took a course in linguistics. And why don't you work with that? I bet you make a lot more than with milk and cheese. Because my place is here taking care of my parents' land. Sarah, said Mr. Arthur, his voice more serious, your parents were proud of you for studying. They wouldn't want you to waste that talent just because of the farm. Those words echoed in Sarah's mind during the entire trip back. Mr. Arthur had touched on a point she avoided thinking about. Was she really honoring her parents' memory, or just hiding from the world? When she got home, it was already night. The farm seemed even quieter than usual. The cows were in the pasture and the house was dark. Sarah turned on the lights and sat down in the kitchen where she had so often studied for college exams while her mother prepared dinner. She grabbed a beer from the fridge and stared at the photos on the wall. There was one from her graduation day, with her parents beside her, both smiling with obvious pride. Another from her exchange program in the United Kingdom, sent by letter because WhatsApp didn't exist back then, and several of the family working together on the farm over the years. The phone rang again. This time it was Megan, her only close friend, who lived in the city and worked at the registry office. Sarah, I heard you confronted Grant Sterling today. The whole town is talking. What do you mean? His secretary is my neighbor's cousin. She said he went ballistic after you left. Sounds like you really got him rattled. I hope he doesn't cause any trouble. Look, I think you should be careful. Grant isn't the kind of person who easily forgets when someone embarrasses him. I know, Megan, but I couldn't let him trick my neighbors. I understand. But now you need to think about protecting yourself. After hanging up, Sarah thought about Megan's words. Had she underestimated Rodrigo's ability to retaliate? The next morning, Sarah woke up early as usual and went to milk the cows. Physical work always helped her organize her thoughts. While working, she decided she would call Professor Eleanor and ask for more details about the opportunity in Chicago. But when she finished milking and returned home, she found an envelope under the door. Inside was a letter from the bank informing her that her debt had been transferred to the Urgent Collections Department and that she had only 15 days to pay the full amount, otherwise the foreclosure process would begin. Sarah felt the world spin. 2 weeks ago, the manager had said she would have at least 2 months. Something had changed, and she suspected who had caused that change. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. Sarah immediately called the bank. After a half-hour wait, she managed to speak with the manager, Mr. Charles, who had always been understanding of her situation. Sarah, I'm sorry, but I received orders from the board. Your account has been classified as high risk and needs to be settled quickly. But you said I had more time. I know, but things have changed. I received a call yesterday informing me that there's interest from third parties in your property, which indicates you have the means to pay off the debt. Sarah didn't need to ask who had made that call. Mr. Charles, I need more time. 15 days is impossible. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do. The decision came from above. Sarah hung up the phone feeling defeated. Grant had carried out his threat. Now she had 2 options: accept his offer for a very low price or lose everything to the bank. That's when she remembered Professor Eleanor's offer. She called immediately. Professor, about that job opportunity. Great, I've been waiting for your call. I spoke with my contact and they're very interested. They can pay you $15,000 a month plus benefits. It was a very good amount, but Sarah quickly did the math. Even with that salary, it would take 3 months to save up the money for the debt. Time she didn't have. Is there any possibility of an advance? Let me see. I can ask if they'd pay the first month in advance, but that would be it. All right, Professor. When would the interview be? Tomorrow, if you want. They're in a hurry. Sarah spent the rest of the day organizing the documents she'd need to take to Chicago. She also called some neighbors, trying to find someone who could look after the farm temporarily if she got the job. Mrs. Martha, a 65-year-old woman who had been living alone since she was widowed, offered to help. Sarah, you helped me so much when my husband was sick. Now it's my turn to repay you. Mrs. Martha, are you sure? It's a lot of work. Child, I took care of a farm 3 times the size of yours for 40 years. I know exactly what to do. The next morning, Sarah took the first bus to Chicago. The interview was at 2 in the afternoon at an office in the financial district. She had picked her best clothes, but she still felt out of place among the mirrored buildings and suited executives. The company was called Global Business Linguistics and occupied an entire floor of a modern building. Sarah was greeted by an elegant woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Victoria, the HR manager. "Professor Eleanor spoke very highly of you," Victoria said, pointing to a chair. "She said you have experience with international contracts." "Yes, I worked in the United Kingdom for 6 months at a law firm." "Perfect. We urgently need someone to translate a series of contracts for a very important client. It's a 3-month project, but it can be extended if the work is good." Victoria explained the job details. It would be home office 3 days a week and in-office 2 days. The salary was even better than Professor Eleanor had mentioned, $18,000 a month. "When can I start?" Sarah asked. "Immediately, if you want. In fact, we have an urgent demand for this week. If you accept, I can authorize a 2-month salary advance." Sarah felt a wave of relief. $36,000 would be enough to pay off the bank debt and still have some money left for the initial expenses in Chicago. "I accept," Victoria smiled. "Great. I just need you to sign a few documents so you can start today." While Sarah read the employment contracts, Victoria left the room to get more papers. Sarah took the opportunity to look out the window. The view was stunning, but she couldn't stop thinking about the empty farm in Asheville. Victoria returned with a stack of documents. "These are the contracts you need to translate by Friday. They're urgent." Sarah looked at the papers and almost fell out of her chair. On the first page was the header of Green Valley Corp. It was the same project as Grant's, only now with a different location. "Excuse me," said Sarah. "May I ask who the Brazilian client is on this project?" "Sterling and Partners." "Why do you ask?" Sarah felt a chill down her spine. Grant had changed the project location, but he was still moving forward, and now she discovered that the company hiring her also worked for him. "I just recognized the name of the American company." "Yes, they are an important client of ours. In fact, it was Mr. Grant who suggested we look for a translator specialized in rural contracts." The world seemed to spin around Sarah. Grant had orchestrated everything. He had pressured the bank to speed up her debt collection and at the same time created a job opportunity that would force her to leave the region. And worst of all, she would be forced to translate the contracts that would allow him to profit millions from a project similar to what he had tried to do on her land. "Any problem?" asked Victoria, noticing Sarah's expression. "No, no problem." But Sarah knew she was in a perfect trap. If she refused the job, she would lose the farm to the bank. If she accepted, she would be helping Grant get rich at the expense of other small landowners in another region. "Can I take the documents home today and start tomorrow?" "Of course, but remember, the deadline is tight." Sarah left the office feeling like she had sold her soul. Grant had won even after losing the bet. He had forced her to leave her land, and now he would make her work for him, even if indirectly. During the trip back, Sarah read some of the contracts. They were even more complex than the one she had translated the day before. And she discovered something that disturbed her even more. The new project would be developed in a region of West Virginia, where mostly families of small farmers lived, people like her and her neighbors. When she got home, she found Mrs. Martha feeding the cows. "How did it go, dear?" "I got the job, Mrs. Martha, but I think I made a terrible mistake." "Why?" Sarah told her neighbor everything. Mrs. Martha listened in silence, nodding occasionally. "Sarah, you're in a very difficult situation, but remember one thing. Sometimes we have to go through bad situations to find a better way out." "I don't understand." "You now have access to their contracts, don't you? You know exactly what they're planning to do. Maybe you can use that information to help the families in the region that will be affected." Sarah had never thought of that. Mrs. Martha was right. Being on the inside of the project would give her valuable information about Grant's plans. "You're right. But how can I help people I don't even know?" "Do you know someone who works with rural movements, unions, cooperatives?" Sarah remembered Nathan, a college friend who had specialized in agrarian law and worked with farmer organizations. "Yes, I do." "Then call him. Explain the situation." Sarah called Nathan that same night. They hadn't spoken in 2 years, but he remembered her well. "Sarah, good to hear from you. How are things?" "Complicated, Nathan. I need advice on an ethical issue." Sarah explained the whole situation. Nathan listened carefully. "Let me get this straight. You were forced to accept a job translating contracts for a project that could harm rural families." "Exactly. And you have access to the complete project documents?" "Yes. Sarah, you're in a unique position to help these families. If you can get information about the company's plans, I can pass it along to organizations in that region that work to defend rural rights. But wouldn't that be unethical? I'm being paid to translate, not to leak information." "It depends on how you see the situation. If the project is being carried out dishonestly, deceiving the landowners, you would only be balancing the informational scales." Sarah spent the whole night thinking about her conversation with Nathan. The next morning she made a decision. She would accept the job, but she would make copies of all important documents to pass on to Nathan. It would be risky, but it was the only way to try to turn a bad situation into something positive. She started working on the translation of the contracts. The more she read, the more outraged she became. Grant was using exactly the same tactics he had tried to use with her and her neighbors. Low offers for valuable properties, false information about the true potential of the projects, and psychological pressure on the landowners. But this time, the victims were 53 families in a rural region of West Virginia. Grant had learned from his previous mistake and was being more careful. Instead of trying to buy contiguous lands, he was targeting a wider area, buying strategic properties that would control access to a future highway, linking a new mining operation to the Port of New York. Sarah made digital copies of all important documents and gave them to Nathan. He was impressed by the level of detail in the scheme. "Sarah, this is very serious. I'll pass it on to the folks at the Farmers Union Federation of West Virginia. They need to alert these families immediately." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah maintained a double routine. During the day, she translated contracts for the company. At night, she helped Nathan understand the technical aspects of the documents so the rural organizations could prepare a proper defense. That's when she discovered something that completely changed her perspective on the situation. In one of the most technical clauses of the contract, there was a reference to prior environmental compensation that caught her attention. Reading more carefully, she discovered that Grant was planning to use a legal loophole to declare the area as of public utility, which would allow the expropriation of the lands for an even lower price than his already low offers. "Nathan," Sarah said on the phone, "I found something very serious here." "What?" "They're planning to force an expropriation. The families could lose their lands for practically nothing. That's criminal." "No, unfortunately it's legal, but there's a way to stop it." Sarah had discovered that the expropriation process depended on an environmental impact study that had not yet been completed. If the communities could challenge that study before its approval, they could delay the project for months or even years. "I need more details about that study," Nathan said. "Do you have access to that information?" "Not yet, but I know where to find it." Sarah started investigating more deeply. She found out that the environmental impact study was being done by a third-party company and that the preliminary results were being discussed in internal meetings at Sterling and Partners. That's when she had a risky idea. If she could attend one of those meetings as the official translator, she could get first-hand information. She spoke with Victoria about the possibility of attending in-person meetings with the client. Actually, they mentioned they might need a translator for some meetings with American executives. "Would you be interested?" "Of course." "Great. I'll check when the next one is." 2 days later, Victoria called Sarah. "Are you available for a meeting tomorrow at 10 in the morning? It'll be at the Sterling and Partners office." Sarah felt her heart race. She would meet Grant again, but this time as his employee, albeit indirectly. "Yes, I'm available." "Perfect. It's an important meeting with executives from Green Valley Corp. They'll discuss the next steps of the project." Sarah spent the night preparing. She studied all the documents she had translated so far and prepared discreet questions she could ask to get more information. The next morning, she was back in Grant's office. This time, she was greeted by his secretary, who led her directly to the conference room. Grant hadn't arrived yet. The room was full of executives she didn't know, plus 2 Americans who were clearly from Green Valley Corp. Sarah introduced herself as the translator and sat discreetly in a chair in the corner. When Grant entered the room, he paused for a moment upon seeing her, but quickly masked his surprise. "Good morning, everyone," he said. "Let's start our meeting." During the first hour, Sarah translated technical discussions about timelines and budgets, nothing she didn't already know from the documents. But when the conversation shifted to regulatory issues, her ears perked up. One of the American executives asked about the local resistance problem in the West Virginia region. "We already have information that some organizations are trying to organize the landowners," said Grant. "But we are taking steps to neutralize that resistance." "What kind of steps?" asked the American. Sarah translated the question, but stayed alert for the answer. "We're accelerating individual negotiations and offering special incentives for those who close deals quickly. We're also influencing certain administrative decisions to create additional pressure." Sarah knew exactly what that meant. Grant was using the same tactic he had used on her, pressuring financial institutions and public agencies to force landowners to sell. One of the Brazilian executives mentioned the environmental impact study. "The preliminary report should be ready next week. If approved, we can start the process of declaring public utility." "And if it's not approved?" asked the American. "We have a plan B," said Grant with a smile. "We know people at the agency responsible for approval." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Grant was openly admitting he had undue influence over the environmental approval process. The meeting continued for another hour, but Sarah had already heard enough. When it ended, Grant approached her. "Sarah, what a coincidence to find you here." "It's my job, Mr. Grant." "Of course. And how are things on the farm?" "Good, thank you. I hope there are no problems with your new career in the big city. It would be a shame if you had to go back to the countryside because of professional complications." The threat was clear. Grant knew she was working for the company translating his contracts and was making it clear that any trouble would be linked to her. Sarah left the office with more information than she expected, but also with the certainty that she was in dangerous territory. Grant wasn't just a dishonest businessman. He was someone with powerful connections willing to use every resource to get what he wanted. She called Nathan as soon as she left the building. "Nathan, I need to tell you what I heard today." Sarah recounted the entire meeting. Nathan was shocked. "Sarah, this is very serious. They're planning to corrupt the environmental approval process." "I know, but how do we prove it?" "We need more concrete evidence. Can you record any of these meetings?" "It would be too risky. If they find out, I could face criminal charges." "I understand, but without evidence it's hard to stop what they're planning." Sarah spent the weekend tormented. She knew she had information that could save 53 families from being cheated, but using that information could destroy her own life. That's when she received an unexpected call. It was Mr. Arthur, her neighbor. "Sarah, my girl, I need to tell you something. That Grant showed up here again." "What do you mean?" "He came to offer me money to convince you to sell your property. He said if I succeeded, he'd pay me a commission." Sarah was furious. "And what did you say?" "I told him he could shove his money where the sun doesn't shine, but I figured you should know." "Thank you for warning me, Mr. Arthur." "Sarah, that man isn't going to give up easily. He's determined to get your land by any means." After hanging up, Sarah realized her situation had changed again. Grant hadn't given up on her property. He was just changing his tactics, and if he managed to pressure her neighbors, she'd be isolated, making it much easier to force her to sell. That's when she made a definitive decision. Regardless of the risks, she wouldn't allow Grant to keep harming innocent families. At the next meeting, she'd find a way to get concrete evidence of his illegal practices. The opportunity came the following week. Victoria called to inform her about an urgent meeting to discuss sensitive issues of the project. "It'll be a closed meeting just with the core team of the project," Victoria said. "They specifically asked for you as the translator, since you're familiar with all the documents." Sarah knew this was her chance. She prepared meticulously, including downloading a recording app on her phone and practicing how to activate it discreetly. The meeting was even more revealing than she expected. Grant was clearly nervous about the growing resistance in the West Virginia region. The rural organizations, alerted by the information Sarah had passed on through Nathan, were mobilizing families and challenging the low offers. "The situation is getting complicated," Grant said. "Some families are flat out refusing to sell." "How many?" asked one of the Americans. 32 out of 53. That's more resistance than we expected." One of the Brazilian executives suggested raising the offers. "Impossible," Grant said. "That would make the project economically unfeasible." "Then what's the solution?" the American insisted. "We need to speed up the expropriation process, and for that, we need the environmental study approved this week." "Is the study actually ready?" Grant hesitated for a moment. "The official study still has some outstanding issues, but we have a parallel report that meets our objectives." Sarah almost dropped her phone when she heard that. Grant was admitting they had two studies, one real and another fabricated to justify the expropriation. "How does that work?" the American asked. "Simple. We present the report that favors our project. If anyone questions it later, we claim there was a misunderstanding and present the real study. But by then, the expropriation process will have already started, and it'll be very hard to reverse." Sarah was recording everything. She finally had concrete evidence of Grant's illegal practices. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, with details on how to speed up the process and how to handle potential legal challenges. When it ended, Sarah left the office with her heart racing, but certain that she now had the tools needed to stop Grant's plans. She immediately called Nathan. "Nathan, I have concrete evidence of everything they're planning." "What kind of evidence?" "Recordings of meetings where they admit to having fake environmental studies and plans to illegally expedite expropriations." "Sarah, that's incredible. But you know you got those recordings in a risky way, right?" "I know. But I can't let 53 families be deceived. I'll take this to the Federation people right away. With this evidence, we can file a lawsuit to suspend the entire project." Over the following days, Sarah lived on an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, she was relieved to have finally done the right thing. On the other, she was terrified of the possible consequences. Nathan called on Wednesday with good news. "Sarah, we did it!" The Federation filed a lawsuit with the Public Prosecutor's Office of West Virginia. Based on the evidence you provided, they got an injunction suspending all proceedings on the project until there is a full investigation into irregularities in the process. And now? Now Grant is going to have to explain why he has two different environmental studies and how he planned to influence the approval process. Sarah felt a wave of relief, but she knew her worries were just beginning. Grant would quickly find out that she had leaked the information, and the consequences would be severe. In fact, she didn't have to wait long. On Friday, Victoria called with a tense voice. "Sarah, I need you to come to the office immediately. There's been a very serious problem with the Green Valley Corp project." "What kind of problem?" "I'd rather talk in person." Sarah knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. When she got to the office, she found Victoria with a very serious expression. "Sarah, the Green Valley Corp project has been suspended by a court injunction, and there is evidence that confidential project information was leaked to organizations that challenged the process." "I understand. The company is investigating how that information reached third parties. Do you have any idea how this might have happened?" Sarah knew she could lie, but she was tired of this whole game. "I was the one who passed along the information." Victoria was shocked. "What do you mean?" "I found out the project was being developed dishonestly, deceiving rural families. I couldn't stay quiet knowing that." "Sarah, do you realize the seriousness of what you've done? This is a breach of confidentiality. You could face criminal prosecution." "I know, but 53 families were being deceived. I couldn't allow that." Victoria was silent for a few moments. "Unfortunately, I'm going to have to fire you immediately, and the company will likely file a lawsuit against you." "I understand." Sarah left the office knowing she had lost her job and would probably face legal trouble, but she also knew she had done the right thing. On the bus back to Asheville, she received a call from Nathan. "Sarah, I heard you got fired. I'm sorry." "It's okay, Nathan. I knew it was coming. But I have good news. The Public Prosecutor's Office investigation has already found enough evidence to open a criminal case against Grant and his company for fraud and attempted corruption. Really? Yes, and more. The recordings you made are key to the case. You'll probably be called as a witness, but you won't face any criminal trouble because you were acting to report a crime. Sarah felt immense relief. Finally, after weeks of tension, it seemed things were turning in her favor. But when she got home, she found Mr. Arthur waiting for her with a worried expression. "Sarah, girl, we have a problem." "What happened?" "Grant sent some men here today. They said you owe him money, and if you don't pay up quickly, they're going to take action." Sarah was confused. "What debt? I don't owe him anything." "They showed some papers saying you signed a service contract and didn't fulfill it." "That's a lie. I never signed anything with him." "I know, girl, but they seemed very determined." Sarah understood that Grant was desperate and resorting to increasingly dirty tactics. With the project suspended and a criminal investigation underway, he was trying to pressure her any way he could. She called Nathan again. "Nathan, Grant is making up fake debts to pressure me. That's harassment and document forgery. I'll pass this on to the prosecutor in charge of the case immediately. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you need to document everything. If they come back, record everything they say, and don't sign anything, no matter how much they pressure you." Sarah spent the weekend in constant tension, waiting for Grant's men to return, but at the same time she began to feel like she was finally seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. On Monday, she received an unexpected call from Professor Eleanor. "Sarah, I heard you had trouble with that translation job." "Yes, Professor. I had to make a difficult decision." "I understand, but I have a proposal for you. A reputable translation company is looking for someone to work exclusively with rural and environmental contracts. The salary is good, and you can work from home." "That would be perfect, Professor. The company is called Agro Legal Translations, and it specializes in helping small farmers understand contracts and legal documents. It's exactly the opposite of what you were doing before." Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks. Finally, an opportunity that didn't conflict with her values. "When can I talk to them?" "Tomorrow, if you'd like. The owner of the company, Dr. Paul, is very interested in your profile." On Tuesday, Sarah had a video conference with Dr. Paul, a lawyer specializing in agrarian law who had created the company to help small farmers defend themselves against abusive contracts. "Sarah, Professor Eleanor told me your story. What you did took a lot of courage and shows exactly the kind of character I look for in my employees." "Thank you, Doctor. Our company works precisely to prevent what almost happened to you from happening to other families. We translate and explain contracts so that farmers know exactly what they're signing. That's exactly the kind of work I'd like to do." "Perfect. I can offer $12,000 a month to start, with raises based on results, and you can work entirely from home." Sarah accepted immediately. She had finally found a way to use her skills for something positive, without having to abandon her farm. Over the following weeks, her life began to stabilize. The work with Agro Legal Translations was rewarding and well paid. She helped families from all over the United States understand contracts and business proposals, preventing them from being deceived as she almost was. The investigation against Grant was also moving forward. Sarah was called to testify as a witness, and her recordings were crucial in proving the irregularities. The prosecutor in the case, Dr. Frederick, explained that Grant faced charges of fraud, document forgery, and attempted corruption. "The evidence you provided is very solid," said Dr. Frederick. "It's very likely he'll be convicted and have to pay substantial compensation to the families he tried to deceive." Grant's case made the news in regional newspapers. Sarah was impressed by how the story resonated. Several other similar cases began to emerge, with people reporting similar tactics in other regions. Nathan called to share more good news. "Sarah, the case has become a landmark in the defense of rural rights. Several organizations are using your example to encourage others to report companies using similar tactics." "That's incredible. And there's more. The 53 families in West Virginia have organized and are suing Grant for emotional damages. Each one could receive significant compensation. Meanwhile, Sarah was managing to reorganize her finances. With her new job, she was able to renegotiate her bank debt under much better terms. Mr. Charles, the manager, even apologized for the pressure he had applied weeks earlier. "Sarah, after I learned the whole story, I understood you were being subjected to unfair pressure. I managed to reverse the risk classification on your account. Thank you, Mr. Charles. Actually, I should be the one thanking you. We discovered that other clients were also being pressured in a similar way. Your report helped us identify a pattern of behavior that we do not tolerate." 3 months later, Sarah received an unexpected call. It was Arthur, the lawyer who had witnessed her bet with Grant. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind the call." "Of course not, Arthur. I wanted to let you know that Grant was convicted in the first instance. 3 years in prison and a fine of $2 million. Wow. And there's more. The judge determined that part of the fine will be used to compensate the affected families. You are also entitled to compensation for the emotional distress you suffered." Sarah was silent for a few moments, processing the information. "And his company?" "It went bankrupt. All properties and assets are being auctioned to pay the compensations." When she hung up, Sarah sat on the porch of her house and looked out at her land. 6 months earlier, she had been desperate, thinking she would lose everything. Now she had not only saved her property, but had also helped dozens of other families protect themselves from similar scams. Mrs. Martha appeared carrying a coffee. "How was the call, dear?" "Grant was convicted, Mrs. Martha. Thank God, that man deserved it. And I'm going to receive compensation." "That's good. You'll be able to invest in the farm." Sarah smiled. That was exactly what she intended to do. With the compensation money, she planned to modernize production and maybe even create a small training center to help other rural producers understand their rights. A few weeks later, she received an unexpected visit. It was Victoria, her former boss from the translation company. "Sarah, can I talk to you?" "Sure. I wanted to apologize for what happened. After I learned the whole story, I understood you did the right thing." "Thank you, Victoria. Actually, I came here with a proposal. Our company is changing direction. We want to work only with ethical projects. I'd like you to come back as our Director of Ethics and Social Responsibility." Sarah was surprised by the offer. "It's an interesting proposal, but I'm very happy with my current job." "I understand. But if you change your mind, the position is open." After Victoria left, Sarah thought about how her life had changed. 6 months earlier, she felt alone and desperate. Now she had job offers. Her financial situation was stable, and she had discovered she had the courage to face difficult situations. But the most important thing was the sense of purpose she had found. Her work at Agro Legal Translations was not just a job, it was a mission. Each contract she translated, each family she helped understand their rights, was a small victory against people like Grant. A month later, she received a letter that deeply moved her. It was from Mrs. Mary, one of the rural producers from West Virginia who had been protected thanks to the information Sarah had passed on. "Dear Sarah, I don't know if you remember me, but I am one of the 53 families you helped save our land. I wanted you to know that your courage changed our lives. My husband and I have had a small property for 30 years, and if we had lost it, I wouldn't know what to do. Now, with the compensation we received, we were able to invest in production and even buy new equipment. My grandchildren will be able to grow up on the same land where I grew up. That is priceless. Thank you for being brave when we needed it." Sarah cried when she read the letter. It was confirmation that all the risks she had taken were worth it. That night, she called Nathan to share the letter. "Sarah, do you realize the impact you've had? It wasn't just those 53 families. Your story inspired other people to report similar situations. In the last few months, the Federation has received 15 reports of similar schemes in different regions. It's amazing how one decision can have such big consequences. That's the domino effect of good. Your courage encouraged others to be brave too." Sarah spent the rest of the night on the porch, looking up at the starry sky over Asheville. She thought about her parents and how proud they would be to see her defending other rural families. They always said the land wasn't just property. It was home, history, identity. Now she fully understood what they meant. And more than that, She understood that defending her land also meant defending the land of other people who had the same emotional and spiritual connection to rural life. 6 months after the case ended, Sarah was organizing an event at the Agro-Legal Translations headquarters in Sacramento. It was the first seminar on rural producers' rights and how to protect yourself from abusive contracts. Over 100 people had signed up. Dr. Paul was excited about the project. "Sarah, this is exactly what we needed, an event that really makes a difference in people's lives. I hope it helps a lot of people." "I'm sure it will." And guess who confirmed their attendance? Nathan and the whole team from the West Virginia Federation. They're going to present a study on how to identify and report fraudulent schemes. The seminar was an absolute success. Sarah told her own story as an example of how it's possible to face tough situations and come out on top. Many people came up to her afterward to share similar stories and ask for advice. An elderly woman, about 70 years old, approached her at the end of the event. "My dear, your story gave me courage. I'm facing a similar situation in my town. A company is pressuring our cooperative to sell our headquarters for a very low price." "Do you have the contracts?" "Yes, I do." "Send them to me by email. I'll review them at no charge." "God bless you, young lady." Cases like this became routine in Sarah's work. She had discovered a calling she didn't know she had. Using her technical knowledge to empower people who, like her, were often underestimated because of their humble background. A year after the whole story began, Sarah was back at the same diner where she had coffee after her first confrontation with Grant. But this time she was there to meet a client who lived in the area. While she waited, she saw a news item in the local paper that made her smile. Grant had been convicted on appeal, confirming his prison sentence. The article mentioned he was trying one last appeal, but the prospects weren't good. The client arrived a few minutes later. He was a young rural producer who was being pressured by a company to sell his land for a solar energy project. "Sarah, thanks for agreeing to help me." "Of course. Let's take a look at these contracts." After reviewing the documents, Sarah found it was a legitimate case. The company was offering fair terms, and the project would genuinely benefit the local community. "In this case, I'd recommend you sign," Sarah said. "The terms are good and the project seems serious." "Thank you. I was afraid it might be another scam." Not all companies are dishonest. The important thing is knowing how to tell when they are and when they aren't. Cases like this mattered too. Sarah had learned that her mission wasn't just to stop bad deals, but also to help people identify good opportunities. On the way back home, Sarah stopped at the town market. Mrs. Rosa, the owner, greeted her warmly. "Sarah, my dear, how are you?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Rosa. I heard you've been helping a lot of people with those complicated contracts." "I'm trying. That makes me proud. Your parents would be so happy to see the strong woman you've become." Those words struck deep in Sarah's heart. It was true. Her parents had always believed she was special, even when she herself doubted it. When she got home, she found a surprise. There was a car parked in front of her house, and Mr. Arthur was talking to a man she didn't know. "Sarah, this gentleman was looking for you," said Mr. Arthur. The man approached with a smile. "Sarah Harrison? I'm a journalist from Rural Horizons magazine. I'd like to do a story about your journey." "A story?" "Yes. Your story has become a national example of how small producers can defend themselves against dishonest companies. We want to tell your path." Sarah hesitated. She didn't really like the spotlight. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Think about the positive impact it could have. Your story can inspire other producers not to give up fighting for their rights." Sarah agreed to think it over. In fact, Nathan had already suggested several times that she write a book about her experience. That night, she called Nathan to talk about the journalist's proposal. "Sarah, I think you should accept. Your story needs to be known. But I don't like being in the spotlight. It's not about whether you like it or not. It's about the good it can do. How many people might be going through the same situation you went through and don't know it's possible to fight back?" Nathan was right. Sarah decided to accept the interview, but with one condition. She wanted the article to include practical information on how to identify abusive contracts and where to seek help. The interview was published 2 months later and had a much bigger impact than Sarah expected. She received hundreds of emails from people telling similar stories and asking for help. That's when she had an ambitious idea. What if she created an online platform where rural producers could submit contracts for free analysis? She talked to Dr. Paul about the possibility. "Sarah, that's a brilliant idea. We could create a network of volunteer lawyers and translators to help people across the country. It would be like a kind of free legal consulting for rural producers." "Exactly. I'll start researching the technical and legal issues to make this happen." The project took 6 months to get off the ground, but when it launched, it exceeded all expectations. In just 1 month, over 1,000 contracts were submitted for analysis. Sarah coordinated a team of 15 volunteers working in different specialties. One of the most impactful cases was an indigenous community in Alaska that was being pressured to sign a logging contract under abusive conditions. Sarah's team analysis revealed clauses that would allow the company to devastate practically the entire area with no environmental responsibility. With the information provided by the team, the community was able not only to refuse the contract, but also to report the company to environmental agencies. The case became national news and helped create stricter laws to protect indigenous lands. Sarah was achieving more than she had ever dreamed, but the most rewarding part remained the thank you letters and emails she received. One email that particularly moved her was from a 25-year-old young man whose parents had lost their land to a company a few years earlier. "Sarah, my parents were tricked by a company that used tactics very similar to what you faced. At the time, they didn't know who to turn to and ended up losing everything. Today I work in the city, but I've never forgotten their pain when they lost the land where they were born. When I read your story, I cried with emotion. I can't help my parents right now, but I'm studying law so I can help other families in the future. You showed me it's possible to fight and win. Thank you for being an example of courage." 2 years after the whole story began, Sarah was back at the building where it all started. But this time she wasn't there as a victim. She was there for a meeting with investors interested in funding the expansion of her platform to protect rural producers. Ironically, the meeting would be in the same room where she had faced Grant for the first time. When she reached the floor, she was greeted by Arthur, the lawyer who had witnessed her bet. "Sarah, what a pleasure to see you here again." "Hi, Mr. Arthur. How are you?" "Very well. Actually, I've followed your entire journey since that day. It's impressive how you turned a bad situation into something so positive. Sometimes difficulties take us to places we never imagined." Arthur walked her to the meeting room. Sarah smiled as she recognized the setting. It was exactly where Grant had tried to humiliate her. Now she was back as a nationally recognized social entrepreneur. The meeting was with 3 social impact investors interested in funding the platform's expansion. Sarah presented the results of 2 years of work. Over 5,000 contracts reviewed, 300 families protected from scams, and a network of 200 volunteers across the country. "Impressive," said one of the investors. "You've managed to create real, measurable social impact." "And what's the projection for the next 3 years?" asked another investor. "We want to reach every rural region of the country. We estimate we can help over 10,000 families in the next 3 years. The investors were impressed with the presentation. At the end of the meeting, they approved a $2 million investment to expand the project. Leaving the building, Sarah paused for a moment on the sidewalk and looked up. It was incredible how her life had changed. 2 years earlier, she had been there feeling small and humiliated. Now, she was leaving with resources to help thousands of families across the country. On the bus ride home, she received a call from Professor Eleanor. "Sarah, I have amazing news for you." "What is it, Professor?" "The university wants to invite you to give a lecture on social entrepreneurship and rural rights advocacy." "Really?" "Yes, and it's not just a lecture. They want to propose creating a course on the subject, and you'd be the guest professor." Sarah was moved. Teaching had always been a secondary dream, something she thought would never be possible. "When would it be?" "Next semester. You'd have to come once a week to Sacramento." "I accept." When she got home, Sarah sat on the porch where she had so often thought about her life and dreams. Mrs. Martha came out with a coffee, as she always did. How was the meeting in the city, dear? We got the investment, Mrs. Martha. We'll be able to help many more families. What joy. Your parents would be so proud. And there's more. I'm going to teach at the university. Professor Sarah, said Mrs. Martha, smiling. That has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? That night, Sarah did something she hadn't done in a long time. She picked up the family photo album and looked at the pictures of her parents. In the last photo they took together, the three of them were on the porch of the house, smiling. Dad, Mom, Sarah whispered, I managed to honor what you taught me. It wasn't the way we imagined, but I did it. The next day, Sarah began writing her memoirs. It was no longer just her personal story, but the story of how a humiliating confrontation turned into a life mission. The book was published a year later with the title Translating Courage: How a Farmer Faced an Empire and Transformed Lives. It became a bestseller in the personal development and inspiration category. During the launch at a bookstore in Chicago, Sarah was approached by a young woman, around 20 years old. Sarah, I'm a law student and your story changed my life. How so? I also come from a rural family. I always felt inferior when I came to study in the big city. Your story showed me that our roots are our strength, not our weakness. Exactly. Never be ashamed of where you come from. I want to specialize in agricultural law to help rural producers, just like you do. That's wonderful. The country needs more people like you. Conversations like this became common at the book events. Sarah discovered that her story resonated especially with young people from rural backgrounds who felt out of place in urban environments. 3 years after the whole story began, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was from a television producer interested in adapting her story into a miniseries. Sarah, your story has all the elements of an inspiring drama: struggle, overcoming, social justice. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. Think about the reach a TV series can have. Your message would reach millions of people. Sarah asked for time to think. She talked it over with Nathan, Dr. Paul, Professor Eleanor, and even Mrs. Martha. They all thought it would be a unique opportunity to amplify her message. But I want to have control over the script, Sarah told the producer. The story needs to be told in a real and respectful way. Of course. You would be the executive consultant for the series. The miniseries Rural Grit aired a year later and broke ratings records. Sarah was amazed to see her story being told by talented actors. Even more impressive was the impact it had. In the weeks following the broadcast, the platform for protecting rural producers received more than 10,000 new registrations. Organizations from other countries reached out wanting to replicate the model. And most importantly, dozens of cases similar to Grant's were reported all across the country. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The prosecutor, Dr. Frederick, called Sarah a few weeks after the series aired. Sarah, you need to know that your story has created a national movement. We are investigating more than 50 cases of companies that use tactics similar to Grant's. 50 cases? Yes. And in half of them, people cited your story as inspiration for reporting. That's incredible. Even more incredible is that we've managed to create a national task force to combat this type of crime. Your individual courage has turned into public policy. Sarah was moved to learn that her personal experience had contributed to structural changes in the country. Around the same time, she received an unexpected invitation. The Department of Agriculture wanted to hire her as a consultant to create a national program to protect small rural producers. It would be an opportunity to impact public policy at the national level, explained the department's advisor. But I've always worked independently. We understand that. That's why we're proposing that you keep your organization and work in partnership with us. Sarah accepted the proposal, but set clear conditions. She would maintain full editorial independence, and her organization would continue to be managed by her. The national program was launched 6 months later and included the creation of regional protection centers for rural producers in every state in the country. Sarah began traveling across the country, training local teams. It was during one of these trips in the interior of Georgia that Sarah had one of the most remarkable experiences of her entire journey. I was training a local team when a woman around 80 years old approached me. "Young lady, are you Sarah from the TV?" "Yes, ma'am, I am." "I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "My grandson was almost selling our farm to a company that wanted to trick him. After he saw your story on TV, he came to talk to me. We reviewed the contract and discovered it was indeed a scam. I'm glad you were able to protect yourselves. That's not all. My grandson is now studying law at night and wants to help other families. He said you inspired him to fight for what's right." Stories like this repeated in several towns Sarah visited. Her journey had created a multiplier effect, inspiring other people to become advocates for rural rights. 4 years after the whole story began, Sarah was back at her farm for the end-of-year holidays. The property had changed a lot. With the money from the settlements and the success of her projects, she had modernized all the production. But the most important changes weren't physical. The farm now served as the headquarters for the NGO Rural Grit, which had become the largest organization protecting rural producers in the country. Over 100 employees worked remotely, and the farm constantly received visits from students and researchers interested in the work model. Mrs. Martha, now 70 years old, remained her closest neighbor and confidant. "Sarah, young lady, you've become an important person." "I'm not important, Mrs. Martha. I just had the luck to be able to help people." "It's not luck, it's character. You've always been this way, you just didn't know it." That New Year's Eve, Sarah organized a party at the farm to celebrate the 2024 results. Present were Professor Eleanor, Nathan, Dr. Paul, and several people who had been part of her journey. During the party, Nathan made a toast. "Sarah, 4 years ago, you were a desperate farmer trying to save your land. Today, you're one of the leading advocates for rural rights in the country. But the most important thing is that you never forgot where you came from." "Thank you, Nathan, but none of this would have been possible without all of you." "That's not true," said Professor Eleanor. "We all supported you, but the courage was yours. You chose to fight when it would have been much easier to give up." After everyone left, Sarah stood alone on the porch, looking at the starry sky. She thought about how her life had changed since that day when Grant tried to humiliate her in the meeting room. Back then, she felt small and insignificant. Now she understood that a person's worth isn't measured by their wealth or social status, but by their willingness to fight for what's right. 5 years after the whole story began, Sarah received a call that deeply moved her. It was from a young lawyer in Brasilia. "Sarah, my name is Victoria Cooper. I'm the daughter of small rural producers, and I graduated in law inspired by your story." "That's wonderful, Victoria. I got a job at the public prosecutor's office and wanted to tell you I'm working on a case very similar to yours. A company is trying to deceive 40 families in my region." "And how can I help?" "Actually, I don't need help. I learned from your story how to identify and fight these practices. I just wanted to thank you for showing the way." Calls like this became common. Sarah's story had inspired a new generation of professionals dedicated to defending rural rights. That same year, Sarah was invited to give a lecture at Harvard University in the United States on innovative models of social justice. It was the first time she had left the country since her exchange program in the United Kingdom 20 years earlier. At the lecture, she told her story to an audience of students from different countries. The reception was warm, and many students came up afterward to learn more about the Brazilian model. One American student especially impressed her. "Sarah, your story made me rethink my career. I was going to work at a big consulting firm, but now I want to dedicate myself to social impact projects." "That's great. The world needs more people willing to make a difference. Can I visit your organization in the US? I'd like to learn more about your work model." "Of course. You'll be very welcome." 6 months later, the young American was at Sarah's farm doing an internship at the NGO. His presence helped establish partnerships with similar organizations in other countries. Sarah realized that her story had transcended borders. She received invitations to speak at events in Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico. Whenever possible, she accepted, especially when it involved helping other countries develop protection mechanisms for small farmers. 7 years after the whole story began, Sarah was preparing a special surprise. She had decided to write a second book, but this time it wouldn't be about her own story. It would be about the stories of the hundreds of people her organization had helped. The book, titled Shared Courage, Stories of Those Who Fought and Won, compiled 50 real cases of families who had protected themselves from corporate scams using the tools developed by Sarah's organization. During the launch, one of the stories that moved Sarah the most was that of Mr. Joseph, a 60-year-old farmer from South Carolina. "Sarah, 3 years ago, my family almost lost our land to a wind energy company that wanted to pay practically nothing for our property. When we found your organization, we discovered our land was worth 10 times more than what they offered. Today we have a fair contract, and our family remains on our grandparents' land." Stories like Mr. Joseph's multiplied over the years. Sarah's organization had directly helped over 2,000 families and indirectly impacted tens of thousands through educational campaigns and training. In 2029, 8 years after the whole story began, Sarah received an honor that deeply moved her. The National Farmers Union created the Sarah Harrison Award to recognize people who stand out in defending the rights of rural producers. "It's an honor to have my name associated with this cause," Sarah said during the ceremony. "But I want everyone to remember that this fight didn't start with me and won't end with me. It's a fight of all rural families in the United States." During the ceremony, Sarah met several people who had been part of her journey. One of the most emotional was Arthur, the lawyer who had witnessed her first confrontation with Grant. "Sarah, do you remember me?" "Of course, Dr. Arthur. How are you?" "Very well. I wanted to tell you that after following your story, I completely changed my career. I left Grant's company and now work exclusively defending rural producers." "That's wonderful. Your courage that day made me question what kind of lawyer I wanted to be. Today I can say I work for the right side." Conversations like this confirmed for Sarah that her decision to confront Grant had had ramifications far beyond what she could have imagined. At the end of 2029, Sarah made an important decision. After 8 years leading the organization, she decided to hand over the presidency to Nathan, her friend and partner since the beginning of the journey. "Nathan, you know this work as well as I do. It's time for new leadership." "Sarah, are you sure?" "I am. I want to dedicate myself more to writing and teaching, and I know the organization will be in great hands." The transition was smooth and emotional. During Nathan's inauguration ceremony, Sarah gave a speech that summed up her philosophy of life. "I learned that true strength doesn't come from how much money we have or what position we hold. It comes from our willingness to fight for what's right, even when we are alone and winning seems impossible. Every one of you has that strength within you. Never doubt it." At 50 years old, Sarah devoted herself more intensely to teaching. In addition to her university classes, she created a free online course on the rights of rural producers that reached over 100,000 students across the country. She also increased her literary output. She wrote 3 more books, including a novel inspired by the stories she had encountered over the years. Her books became references in the field of rural development and social justice. In 2031, 10 years after the start of the whole story, Sarah decided to take a special trip. She wanted to revisit all the regions where her organization had worked to see firsthand the long-term impact of their efforts. The first stop was West Virginia, where it all began with the 53 families threatened by Grant. Sarah was moved to see how the region had prospered. The families who had kept their land had formed a cooperative and were exporting organic products to several countries. Mrs. Mary, the producer who had written the first thank you letter to Sarah, was now the president of the cooperative. "Sarah, you have no idea how your courage changed our lives. Today we are an example of sustainable rural development for the whole country. The credit is all yours. I just helped you see the value of what you already had." "That's not true. Without your initial courage, we never would have had this opportunity." During the visit, Sarah met Mrs. Mary's grandchildren, children who grew up knowing the story of how a brave farmer had saved their land. "Aunt Sarah," said the youngest grandchild, "when I grow up, I want to help people like you do." "You can already help," replied Sarah. "Helping starts with small actions. like being kind to others and standing up for what's right. The journey continued through other states. In every place, Sarah found stories of transformation and hope. Families who had kept their land, young people inspired by her story to study and gain skills, local organizations that replicated her work model. In Goiás, she met the 80-year-old woman who had thanked her years before. Now 85, she remained active, and her grandson had become a lawyer specializing in agrarian law. "Grandma, this is the Sarah I told you about," said the grandson. "Girl, you haven't changed a bit," said the woman, hugging Sarah. "You still have that sweet smile of yours. You're the one who moves me. How's the farm?" "Better than ever. My grandson modernized everything, but without losing the family essence." At every stop of the trip, Sarah confirmed that her decision to face Grant had been the starting point for changes she could never have imagined. The last stop of the trip was in Asheville, her hometown. The farm where it all began remained her base, but now also served as a training center for rural leaders from all over Latin America. Mrs. Martha, now 75, remained her closest neighbor and confidant. "Sarah, child, you have achieved more than your parents ever dreamed. I think I achieved exactly what they dreamed, using my education to help others. It's true. They always said you were special." That night, Sarah sat on the same porch where she had so often reflected on her life. She was alone, but she didn't feel alone. She felt connected to thousands of people whose lives had crossed paths with hers over the years. She picked up her phone and found a message from Nathan. "Sarah, I wanted you to know that the organization hit a new record this month. We helped 300 families just in December. None of this would have been possible without your initial courage. Thank you for showing that it's possible to fight and win." Sarah smiled and typed a reply. "Nathan, the courage isn't mine. It belongs to all the people who choose to fight for what's right. Keep up this important work." At 51, Sarah Harrison had become one of the leading voices for rural rights in the United States. But more important than any recognition was the certainty that she had lived a life consistent with her values. Lying in bed that night, Sarah thought about the journey that had begun with a humiliation in a conference room. If someone had told her back then that she would become a national reference, she wouldn't have believed it. But now she understood that life's hardest moments are often the doorways to the most meaningful chapters. Grant had tried to humiliate her, but without knowing it, he had awakened a strength she didn't know she had. The following year, Sarah published her most personal book, Letters to Myself, What I Wish I Had Known Before Starting. It was a compilation of reflections on leadership, courage, and life purpose, written as a series of letters to the young Sarah who had faced Grant for the first time. One of the letters said, "Dear Sarah of the past, I know you're scared and feeling small in front of powerful men who try to intimidate you. I want you to know that you are much stronger than you imagine. The upbringing your parents gave you, the determination you inherited from them, and the sense of justice you carry in your heart are powerful tools. Don't be afraid to use your voice. Don't be afraid to fight for what's right. And above all, never be ashamed of where you come from. They are your strength, not your weakness. The path won't be easy, but it will be rewarding. You'll discover you have the ability to transform not only your own life, but the lives of thousands of others. Trust yourself. The world needs your courage. With love, Sarah of the Future." The book became a bestseller and was adopted as required reading in several leadership and personal development courses. In 2033, 12 years after the start of the whole story, Sarah received the most special invitation of her career. The United Nations wanted to appoint her as a Goodwill Ambassador for Sustainable Rural Development. "It's an incredible honor," said the UN representative. "Your story has inspired similar movements in dozens of countries." "I accept with humility," Sarah replied, "but on the condition that I can continue living in the United States and focusing primarily on work with local communities." "Of course. In fact, it's exactly that grassroots connection that makes your work so authentic." As a Goodwill Ambassador, Sarah began traveling more around the world, always bringing the American experience of protecting small rural producers. But she always returned to her farm in Asheville, which remained her safe harbor. In 2035, at 55, Sarah made a decision that surprised many. She announced she would retire from all public duties to dedicate herself exclusively to writing and spending time with family. After 14 years fighting in the trenches of social justice, I feel it's time for a new phase. I want to dedicate myself to recording the stories I've lived and perhaps inspire a new generation through literature. Her retirement was marked by a series of tributes across the country. The most moving was a letter signed by over 1,000 families who had been helped by her organization. Sarah, you taught us that it doesn't matter where we come from or how powerful our opponents are. What matters is our willingness to fight for what is right. Thank you for showing the way. Now, it's our turn to carry on the struggle. Sarah was moved as she read the letter. It was confirmation that her mission had been fulfilled. She had planted seeds that would continue to grow long after her departure from the scene. Retired from public duties, Sarah dedicated herself intensely to writing. She wrote 5 more books, including a fiction trilogy about rural women facing challenges similar to those she had faced. Her books were translated into 15 languages and became a worldwide reference in literature on rural empowerment and social justice. In 2040, at age 60, Sarah decided to take a complete stock of her life. Almost 20 years had passed since that traumatic day in the meeting room with Grant. It was time to look back and evaluate what she had built. The numbers were impressive. Her organization had directly helped over 5,000 families, indirectly impacted over 50,000 people, and inspired the creation of similar organizations in 23 countries. But for Sarah, the most important statistics were others. Hundreds of rural youth who had studied and become empowered, inspired by her story, dozens of lawyers and other professionals who had changed careers to dedicate themselves to social justice, and thousands of people who had discovered within themselves the courage to fight for their rights. That year, Sarah received a call that deeply moved her. It was from a 25-year-old young woman who introduced herself as the granddaughter of one of the families from West Virginia that had been protected in Grant's original case. Sarah, my name is Annie. My grandmother always told me your story. It's so good to talk with you, Annie. I wanted you to know that I graduated in law and just passed the exam to become a prosecutor. I want to specialize in crimes against small farmers. That's wonderful. The country needs people like you. All because of your inspiration. I grew up hearing that a brave woman had saved our family, and that motivated me to study so I could help other families. Annie, you move me. Knowing that the story lives on through people like you is the greatest reward I could have. After hanging up, Sarah thought about the meaning of that call. Her story had created a virtuous cycle that would continue to replicate itself for generations. In 2042, at age 62, Sarah released her definitive autobiography, From the Fields to Hope, A Journey of Transformation. The book detailed not only her fight against Grant, but her entire subsequent journey and the lessons learned along the way. On the last page she wrote, "If there is one lesson I would like to leave for whoever reads this story, it is this. Never underestimate the power of an ordinary person who decides to fight for what is right. I was just an indebted farmer with no resources and no influence, but I had something that no money can buy, the determination to defend my dignity and protect other people going through the same situation. Each of you has that same strength within you. No matter how powerful your adversaries may seem or how impossible the situation appears, if you are on the right side of justice, you have a strength that goes far beyond any wealth or influence. Use that strength. The world needs you." The autobiography became a publishing phenomenon, selling over 1 million copies in the first year alone. But more important than commercial success was the social impact. Thousands of people wrote to Sarah telling how the book had inspired changes in their own lives. In 2045, at age 65, Sarah decided to take one last great trip. She wanted to revisit all the countries where she had lectured over the years to see how the movements protecting rural producers had evolved. The trip lasted 6 months and was documented in a series of articles that Sarah wrote for an international newspaper. In each country, she found organizations inspired by her Brazilian model, adapted to local realities. In Argentina, she met a cooperative of small producers that had formed after one of her lectures in Buenos Aires. In Mexico, she visited a rural school that used her books as teaching material. In Colombia, she attended a conference where over 100 rural leaders shared their struggles. But it was in India that Sarah had the most striking experience of the trip. She met a 40-year-old woman who had created an organization to protect small farmers from multinational companies trying to buy their land at ridiculously low prices. Sarah, your story reached us through a book translated into Hindi. When I read about your struggle, I understood that rural women around the world face similar challenges. That's true, the fight for dignity and justice is universal. I wanted you to know that your courage inspired not only me, but hundreds of women in my region. Today we have a protection network covering over 1,000 villages. Sarah was moved to realize that her story had transcended continents and cultures, creating a global network of people committed to social justice. Returning to Brazil, Sarah felt complete. She had lived a full life, rich in purpose and meaning. More importantly, she had created a legacy that would continue impacting lives long after she was gone. In 2047, at 67 years old, Sarah received the greatest honor of her life. The Brazilian government announced the creation of the Sarah Harrison Institute for the Defense of Rural Rights, a permanent institution responsible for coordinating all public policies for the protection of small producers. "It's an honor that surpasses any dream I could have had," Sarah said during the launch ceremony. "But I want everyone to remember that this institute isn't about me. It's about the millions of rural families who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." During the ceremony, several national and international leaders paid tribute to Sarah. But the speech that moved her the most was from Nathan, her longtime friend, who now ran the organization she had founded. "Sarah, you turned a personal humiliation into a national cause. You showed that an ordinary person can make a difference when they have the courage to fight for what's right. But more importantly, you never forgot your roots and always kept your feet on the ground." That night, Sarah returned to her farm in Asheville. Mrs. Martha, now 83 but still lucid and active, was waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee. "How was the ceremony, dear?" "Moving, Mrs. Martha, but I'm glad to be home. This has always been your place. No matter how far you go, you always come back to this land." "That's true. This farm is my anchor." Sitting on the porch, the two women fell silent, gazing at the starry sky over Asheville. Sarah thought about the entire journey she had traveled since that fateful day in the conference room. "Mrs. Martha, do you think my parents would be proud?" "Honey, they were always proud. From the day you were born, they knew you were special. I miss them every day." "They are here, Sarah, in every person you helped, in every family that kept their land because of your struggle. Your parents live on through the good you've done in the world." These words touched Sarah deeply. It was true. Her parents had planted values that she had cultivated and multiplied throughout her entire life. In 2050, at the age of 70, Sarah announced she would write her final book. It would be an open letter to future generations, sharing the most important lessons she had learned over her 7 decades of life. The book, titled Letter to Those to Come, Lessons from a Life Dedicated to Justice, was written over an entire year. Sarah wanted every word to be carefully chosen. In the introduction, she wrote, "Dear young people of the future, I write this letter at 70, looking back on a life that began on a small farm in Asheville and took me to places I could never have imagined. If there's one thing I want you to know, it's that each of you has the power to change the world, no matter how humble your beginnings. My story began with a humiliation that could have destroyed me, but I chose to turn it into fuel to fight for justice. That choice changed not only my own life, but the lives of thousands of others. You will face your own humiliations, your own moments of despair. When that happens, remember, you have a choice. You can let yourself be defeated, or you can use that pain as motivation to create something positive in the world. Choose the second option. The world needs your courage." The book immediately became a classic, adopted as required reading in schools across the country. Sarah was especially delighted when she learned that rural youth were being inspired by the book to continue their studies and fight for their rights. At 72, Sarah made a final decision about her legacy. She donated her entire personal fortune to the institute that bore her name, keeping only enough to live comfortably on her farm. "Money only has value when it's used to do good," she said during the donation announcement. "I'd rather see these resources being used to help other families while I'm still alive." The donation of $20 million allowed the institute to significantly expand its activities, creating service centers in all states across the country. In 2055, at 75, Sarah was at peace on her farm, devoting herself to gardening and reading. She received visitors from around the world who came to meet in person the woman who had become a living legend in the fight for social justice. One visit that touched her deeply was from a delegation of young Africans who were creating similar organizations in their own countries. "Sarah, you showed that it's possible for an ordinary person to create extraordinary change," said the delegation leader. "That gives us hope for our own countries." "You shouldn't look for hope in me," Sarah replied. "Hope is within you in your determination to make a difference." That year, Sarah received a letter that moved her profoundly. It was from Annie, the young prosecutor who had called years before. "Dear Sarah, 15 years have passed since our first conversation. I wanted you to know that I managed to create a specialized department for crimes against rural producers in the District Attorney's Office of West Virginia. We have already prosecuted over 100 companies that used practices similar to Grant's. My grandmother, whom you helped save, passed away last year at 95. Until the end of her life, she told her story to anyone who would listen. She said, 'You had saved not only our land but our dignity. Now I'm the one who keeps telling her story. My children will grow up knowing they must fight for what is right, no matter how hard it seems. Thank you for showing the way. Your legacy is in good hands.'" "With eternal admiration, Annie," Sarah cried when she read the letter. It was confirmation that her struggle had taken deep roots that would continue to grow for generations. At 78 in 2058, Sarah was sitting on her favorite porch when she received a call that made her smile. She was a young journalist who wanted to write an article about the long-term impact of her story. "Sarah, I'd like to ask, if you could go back in time to that day in the meeting room with Grant, would you do anything differently?" Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "You know, for a long time I wished I had been more prepared, more eloquent, more confident. But now I understand that my vulnerability in that moment was a crucial part of the story. If I had been a powerful, influential person, my struggle wouldn't have inspired so many ordinary people to believe they too can make a difference. So you wouldn't change anything. Maybe I would have hugged my parents before they left and told them how much I loved them. But about the fight, I wouldn't change a thing. Every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of despair was part of a journey that was worth it." The conversation with the journalist made Sarah reflect on her entire journey. At 78, she was at peace with herself and the choices she had made. At the end of 2058, Sarah received the most special visit of her life. Nathan, now 70, brought with him a delegation of 50 young people from all over the country who worked in organizations inspired by Sarah's story. "Sarah, these young people represent the third generation of people inspired by your story," said Nathan. "They wanted to meet you in person." Sarah spoke with each of the young people, listening to their stories and projects. She was impressed by the diversity of initiatives, from apps that help rural producers identify abusive contracts to cooperatives that bring small farmers together to negotiate better prices. "You all have exceeded all my expectations," Sarah told the group. "You took a simple story of a stubborn farmer woman and turned it into a quiet revolution that is changing the country." One of the young people, just 22 years old, said something that deeply moved Sarah. "Sarah, you taught us that we don't have to wait for someone to save us. We can be the heroes of our own stories ourselves." That night, after everyone had left, Sarah sat alone on the porch and gazed at the starry sky. She was grateful to have lived long enough to see her story multiply into so many other stories of courage and transformation. At 80 years old in 2060, Sarah was physically frailer, but mentally lucid and spiritually at peace. She received visitors almost daily, always willing to share her experience with anyone genuinely interested in making a difference in the world. Mrs. Martha, now 93, was still her most constant companion. The two women had aged together, witnessing the transformations her struggle had created. "Sarah, dear, you accomplished more in one lifetime than most people would in 10. "Mrs. Martha, I only did what my parents taught me. Stand up for what's right and help those in need. Your parents planted the seed, but you cultivated the tree." In December 2060, Sarah received an honor that moved her more than any other. The National Congress unanimously approved the creation of National Rural Courage Day, celebrated on March 15th, the date of Sarah's first confrontation with Grant. "It's an honor I don't deserve," Sarah said during the ceremony, participating via video conference from her farm. "But if this day inspires even one person to fight for their rights, it will have been worth it." During the ceremony, letters of gratitude from across the country were read. One that particularly touched Sarah was from a rural school. "Mrs. Sarah, our students have studied your story since they were little. You taught us that it doesn't matter where we are born or how humble our origins. What matters is our character and our willingness to fight for what is right. Thank you for showing that heroes can come from anywhere." At 81 years old, Sarah still received letters and emails from all over the world. Her story had been translated into more than 30 languages and adapted into different media, including films, plays, and even an opera. But what delighted her most were the stories of ordinary people who had found courage in her journey to face their own challenges. They weren't just farmers, but teachers who reported irregularities in schools, employees who contested abusive practices in companies, and young people who refused to accept injustices in their communities. In 2062, at 82, Sarah decided to record a series of videos that would serve as her spiritual testament. She wanted to leave behind her deepest reflections on life, courage, and social justice. In the last video of the series, she said, "If there's one thing I'd like to stand out from my story, it's this. Each of you has an extraordinary strength within you. That strength doesn't come from money, social status, or influence. It comes from something much deeper, the decision to live according to your values, even when it's hard. I was an ordinary farmer who almost lost everything to debt. I had nothing special except the stubbornness to not accept being humiliated and the determination to protect others going through the same situation. If I managed to make a difference, you can too. Don't wait for someone to come save you. Be the heroes of your own lives." The videos went viral on social media, inspiring a new generation of young activists worldwide. At 83, Sarah lived peacefully on her farm, surrounded by the affection of friends and the respect of admirers from around the world. Her health was fragile, but her spirit remained strong. One spring morning in 2063, Sarah woke up with a special feeling. She felt it was time to make one last symbolic gesture. She asked Nathan to come visit her urgently. "Nathan, I want you to take me to that building where it all began." "Sarah, are you sure? It's a long trip and you're fragile. I'm sure I need to close the circle." Nathan arranged everything to make the journey comfortable. When they arrived at the building in Sacramento, Sarah asked to go up to the floor where Grant's old office used to be. The space now housed an NGO that provided free legal consulting for small rural business owners. A plaque on the wall read, "Sarah Harrison Rural Legal Support Center." "What perfect irony," Sarah said, smiling. "The place where they tried to humiliate me is now used to empower others." The NGO's director, a young lawyer, was emotional upon receiving Sarah. "It's an honor to have you here. This center has already helped over 2,000 rural producers." "What a joy to hear that." Sarah asked to be alone for a few minutes in the room that had been Grant's office. She sat in the same chair where she had sat 42 years earlier, when she was just a desperate farmer trying to save her land. She closed her eyes and remembered that day. The humiliation, the fear, the feeling of powerlessness. Then she thought about everything that had happened since. Thousands of lives transformed, organizations created, laws changed, a new awareness about the rights of rural producers. "Thank you," Sarah whispered into the void, spiritually addressing her parents who always believed in her, the people who supported her along the journey, and even Grant, who unwittingly had been the catalyst for a transformation he could never have imagined. When Nathan came back into the room, he found Sarah smiling peacefully. "Ready to go home?" "Yes, now I'm ready." On the way back, Sarah gazed at the rural landscape she knew so well. She saw small, well-tended properties, families working the land, children playing in the yards. It was the rural Brazil she had helped protect and strengthen. 3 months after that symbolic trip, on a quiet September morning in 2063, Sarah Harrison passed away peacefully on her farm at the age of 83. She was sleeping on the porch, where she had so often reflected on life, surrounded by the lands she had defended with such love. Mrs. Martha, now 96 years old, was at her side when she passed. "Go in peace, dear girl. You fulfilled your mission," whispered the old friend. News of Sarah's passing spread quickly across Brazil and around the world. Thousands of people paid tribute to the woman who had turned a personal humiliation into a global cause. The president of Brazil declared 3 days of national mourning. Leaders from dozens of countries sent condolences. But the most touching tributes came from ordinary people who had been directly impacted by her struggle. Her collective letter, signed by over 5,000 rural families, said, "Sarah Harrison taught us that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in the good we do. She is gone, but her legacy will continue to live on in every family that kept their land, in every young person who found the courage to fight for their dreams, in every person who refused to accept injustice. Thank you, Sarah, for showing that an ordinary person can do extraordinary things when their heart is in the right place." Sarah's funeral was held at the church in Asheville, but it was broadcast live to the whole world. People from every continent paid their final respects to the farmer who had become a global symbol of courage and social justice. Nathan delivered the main speech at the funeral. "Sarah Harrison was my friend for more than 40 years. I saw her go from an insecure young farmer to one of the leading voices for social justice in Brazil. But what I admired most about her was that no matter how great her recognition became, she never forgot her roots nor lost her simplicity. Sarah taught us that heroism is not about having superpowers or unlimited resources. It is about having the courage to do what is right, even when we are alone and scared. She was a heroine not only on the day she faced Grant, but on every subsequent day when she chose to use her experience to help others. Her body has passed, but her spirit will continue to live in every life she touched, in every injustice we will fight, in every time we choose courage over fear. After the funeral, Sarah was buried in the local cemetery in Asheville, in a simple ceremony as she had always wanted. Her tombstone bore an inscription she herself had chosen years before: Sarah Harrison, 1978-2063, farmer, translator, advocate for justice, showed that courage has no social class. In the months following Sarah's passing, her legacy became even more evident. Organizations around the world reported significant increases in the number of volunteers interested in working on rural social justice. Universities created scholarships in her name. Governments implemented new laws protecting small farmers inspired by her work. But perhaps the most significant tribute came from an unexpected source. Arthur, Grant's former lawyer, who had witnessed the first confrontation between Sarah and her former boss, now 80 years old, wrote a book titled The Other Side of the Table: How Sarah Harrison Changed My Life. In the book, Arthur revealed never-before-known details about that fateful day. When Sarah entered that room more than 40 years ago, we all completely underestimated her. Grant was confident that she would be just another victim of his schemes. I myself thought it would be a quick, inconsequential meeting. But there was something about Sarah that none of us had noticed before. A silent dignity, a determination that shone through even in her vulnerability. When she began translating that contract, I saw something that changed my life forever: the power of competence combined with integrity. That day, Sarah didn't just save her land. She planted a seed of doubt in all of us who were present. I began to question the kind of lawyer I was, the kind of person I wanted to be. It wasn't immediate, but her courage that day was the beginning of a transformation that lasted decades. Sarah Harrison taught me that it doesn't matter which side of the table we're on. What matters is which side of justice we choose to stand on. Arthur's book became a bestseller, and was used in professional ethics courses at universities across the country. It was proof that Sarah's influence had transcended even her initial adversaries. 6 months after Sarah's passing, Nathan organized a special event at the farm that had been her home. It was the first annual Sarah Harrison Conference on Rural Justice, which brought together over 500 participants from 50 countries. During the conference, studies were presented showing the quantifiable impact of Sarah's work. In the United States alone, it was estimated that her initiatives had directly protected more than 80,000 hectares of small farmers' land, representing an economic value of over $500 million. But the most impressive numbers were qualitative. A survey conducted among rural youth showed that 78% knew Sarah's story, and 65% cited her as an inspiration to continue their studies. At American universities, there was a 340% increase in the number of students interested in courses related to agrarian law and sustainable rural development. Annie, the prosecutor who had been inspired by Sarah's story since she was young, gave the keynote speech at the conference. Sarah Harrison left us far more than an inspiring story. She left us a replicable model of how to turn outrage into constructive action. In the last 5 years, the department I created has prosecuted over 300 companies for abusive practices against rural producers. Each case is an extension of the fight Sarah started in that meeting room. During the conference, the creation of the Global Sarah Harrison Network was announced, an international organization that would connect all movements protecting rural producers inspired by the American story. The network already had partner organizations in 42 countries. One of the most emotional moments of the conference came when Mrs. Martha, now 96 but still sharp, was invited to speak about her friendship with Sarah. I met Sarah when she was a 10-year-old girl. I always knew she was special, but I never imagined she would become such an important person to so many. What I admire most about her is that she never changed her core. Until the end of her life, she remained the same generous and stubborn girl I met over 60 years ago. Mrs. Martha's words deeply moved the audience, reminding everyone that behind the international leader there was always a simple person with deep roots in the land she defended. A year after Sarah's passing, an initiative emerged that she surely would have approved of. Professor Eleanor, now retired but still active, created the Sarah Harrison Rural School, an innovative educational project that brought quality education to isolated rural communities. The school operated through mobile units that visited small communities, offering literacy courses, technical training, and education on rural rights. The project was inspired by Sarah's philosophy that education was the most powerful tool for empowerment. Sarah always said that knowledge was power, explained Professor Eleanor during the project launch. This school is our way of democratizing that power, bringing it where it's needed most. The first school unit was installed in a converted van that traveled through the most remote areas of West Virginia. In just 6 months, it had served over 1,000 people in 30 different communities. One of the school's students, a 19-year-old named Caleb, wrote a letter that moved the entire team. I never imagined I could study law living in such a small and isolated community. The Sarah Harrison School not only gave me access to books and knowledge, but showed me that I can dream big without leaving my roots. I want to be a lawyer to defend my community, just like Sarah defended hers. Stories like Caleb's multiplied across the country. The rural school expanded rapidly, with support from companies, universities, and international organizations. Within 3 years, it was operating 15 mobile units covering all regions of Brazil. 2 years after Sarah's departure, something happened that showed how her influence had transcended generations. Sophia, the great-granddaughter of one of the families protected in the original West Virginia case, was accepted at the University of Chicago to study agrarian law. Sophia was only 20, but she carried a family history deeply marked by Sarah's struggle. Her great-grandmother had been one of the 53 families threatened by Grant, and the story had been passed down through 3 generations. I grew up hearing that a brave woman had saved our family, Sophia said during her university admission interview. Now I want to prepare to save other families, just like she did. Sophia's case was not isolated. A survey conducted by the Sarah Harrison Institute identified over 200 young people from families directly benefited by her struggle who had chosen careers related to social justice and the defense of rural rights. Nathan, now 75, was moved to hear about these cases. Sarah always said that true victory wasn't in saving a few specific families, but in inspiring an entire generation to fight for justice. Seeing these young people choosing these careers, I know she achieved exactly that. 3 years after Sarah's departure, Brazil was undergoing a significant transformation in the area of rural rights. The number of reports of abusive practices against small farmers had increased fivefold, but paradoxically the number of effective cases had decreased by half. Dr. Frederick, the prosecutor who had prosecuted Grant, explained the apparent paradox. People are reporting more because they know they have rights and where to seek help. This created an environment where companies think twice before attempting abusive practices. Prevention has become more effective than punishment. This cultural change was attributed directly to Sarah's educational legacy. Her books were used in rural schools across the country, and her story was told on radio programs that reached the most isolated communities. A concrete example of this transformation happened in the interior of Georgia, where a company tried to use tactics similar to Grant's to buy land from small farmers. But this time the community was prepared. Arthur Cooper, the community leader, recounted how they resisted. When the company showed up with those complicated contracts, our first reaction was to seek help. We knew Sarah's story and knew we shouldn't sign anything without fully understanding it. We contacted the institute that bears her name, and we discovered it was just another scam. The community not only rejected the unfair offers, but also organized their properties into a cooperative that became a model of sustainable rural development in the region. 4 years after Sarah's departure, her farm in Asheville had become a pilgrimage site for people from all over the world. The municipal government created the Sarah Harrison Tourist Circuit, which included the farm, the school where she studied, and the main locations related to her story. But the tourism was not just about sightseeing. The farm operated as a training center where visitors learned about sustainable agriculture, rural rights, and community organization. Mrs. Martha, now 100 years old and one of the oldest people in the region, became a kind of guardian of Sarah's memory. Despite her advanced age, she still received visitors and told stories about her friend. Sarah always said that heroes are ordinary people who make the right choices at the right times, Mrs. Martha would tell visitors. She wasn't born special. She became special through the choices she made. One of the most special visitors was Carlos, grandson of Grant Sterling. Carlos was 30 years old and had grown up hearing a very different version of the story. For his family, Sarah had been nothing more than an opportunist who had destroyed his grandfather's business. But when Carlos became an adult and started researching the story on his own, he discovered the truth. He decided to visit Sarah's farm to better understand what had happened. "I'm very sorry for what my grandfather did," Carlos told Mrs. Martha during his visit. "I grew up with a distorted version of the story. But now I understand that Sarah was standing up for her rights and the rights of other families." Carlos had become a lawyer specialized in rural conflict mediation, dedicating his career to resolving disputes peacefully and fairly. "It's ironic," he said. "My grandfather tried to destroy Sarah, but in the end it was her story that inspired me to choose a career devoted to justice." Carlos's visit was widely reported in the media and became a powerful symbol of how Sarah's legacy was transforming even the families of her former adversaries. 5 years after Sarah's departure, the Sarah Harrison Institute published a comprehensive report on the impact of her work. The numbers were impressive. More than 15,000 rural families directly protected, 127 organizations created inspired by her model, 2.3 million people indirectly impacted through educational programs, 156 municipal and state laws changed to better protect small farmers, 3,400 professionals trained in courses on rural rights. But beyond the numbers, the report highlighted profound qualitative changes. There was a transformation in how Brazilian society viewed small rural producers. The prejudice and discrimination Sarah had faced were giving way to a new respect and appreciation. Dr. Paul, who had worked with Sarah for more than 20 years, summarized this transformation. Sarah taught us that we shouldn't judge people by their appearance or social background. We should judge them by their character and their actions. This lesson changed not just the rural world, but Brazilian society as a whole. 6 years after Sarah's departure, an event occurred that she would certainly have considered her greatest victory. The National Congress unanimously passed the Sarah Harrison Small Farmers Protection Law, comprehensive legislation that established national guidelines to protect rural communities from abusive corporate practices. The law included several innovative measures: creation of a national alert system for suspicious contracts, mandatory free legal assistance for rural producers in negotiations with large corporations, severe penalties for companies using false information or psychological pressure, funds for training and education of rural communities. Annie, now Attorney General of West Virginia, was one of the main architects of the law. This law is the culmination of decades of struggle initiated by Sarah Harrison. She turned a personal case into a national cause, and now that cause becomes permanent public policy. During the signing ceremony of the law, the President of the Republic gave an emotional speech. Sarah Harrison taught us that the greatness of a nation is not measured by the wealth of its powerful, but by the dignity of its humblest. This law is our way of honoring that lesson. The ceremony was broadcast live nationwide and was attended by hundreds of people who had been impacted by Sarah's work. Nathan, now 80 years old, represented the Sarah Harrison Institute at the ceremony. Sarah always said she didn't want to be remembered as a hero, but as an ordinary person who did the right thing, Nathan said during his speech. This law proves that when ordinary people do the right thing, they can change the destiny of an entire country. 7 years after Sarah's passing, her story gained a new international dimension. The United Nations created the Global Sarah Harrison Program to support small rural producers in developing countries. The program was based on models developed in Chicago and adapted to different cultural and economic realities. In its first year, it was already operating in 15 countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Professor Eleanor, now 85 years old, was invited to direct the program. It's moving to see how Sarah's story transcended borders. We proved that the fight for justice is universal, and that methods developed in a small American town can be applied anywhere in the world. One of the most impactful cases of the program was in Senegal, where a community of small farmers was being pressured by a European multinational to sell their land for ridiculously low prices. Using the techniques developed by Sarah, the community was able not only to resist the pressure, but also to negotiate a fair deal that benefited all parties. Amadou Diallo, the leader of the Senegalese community, sent a thank you letter that moved the entire program team. We never imagined that the story of an American farmer could help us here in Senegal. But Sarah Harrison taught us that courage has no nationality. We applied her methods and managed to protect our ancestral land. Now our children can grow up in the same place where our grandparents grew up. 8 years after Sarah's passing, a new generation of leaders emerged who had grown up hearing her story as a living legend. These young people, now in their 20s and 30s, were taking on important positions in organizations, companies, and government. A striking example was Julia Bennett, 28 years old, who became the youngest Secretary of Rural Development in the history of the state of Chicago. Julia had written her master's thesis on Sarah's legacy and applied her principles to the public policies she developed. Sarah Harrison showed us that it's possible to be firm without being aggressive, to be strong without being arrogant, Julia said during her inauguration. These lessons will guide all the policies we develop. Under Julia's leadership, Chicago became the first state to fully implement the principles of the Sarah Harrison Law, creating a model that was soon replicated by other states. 9 years after Sarah's departure, Mrs. Martha, now 102 years old, still lived in her house next to Sarah's old farm. Despite her advanced age, she remained sharp and continued to receive visitors interested in learning more about her friend. In a special interview to mark the 9th anniversary of Sarah's passing, Mrs. Martha shared a reflection that perfectly summed up the legacy she left behind. Sarah taught me that age is just a number. Courage is what counts. She was 43 years old when she faced that powerful man, but the courage she showed that day was fueled by a lifetime of right values. Today, I see 20-year-olds with the same courage she had. That means her story didn't die with her. Mrs. Martha's interview went viral on social media, being shared millions of times. Phrases like, "Courage has no age," and "Right values fuel courage" became mottos for a new generation of activists. 10 years after Sarah's departure, the country held a national ceremony to mark the date. Over a decade, the nation had transformed significantly regarding rural rights, and Sarah was widely recognized as the catalyst for that change. The main event was held in the federal capital, but simultaneous ceremonies took place in every state. In Asheville, thousands of people gathered at Sarah's farm for a special tribute. Nathan, now 85 years old, delivered the keynote speech. 10 years have passed since Sarah left us physically, but her presence has never been stronger. Every family that keeps their land, every young person who chooses to fight for justice, every law that protects the most vulnerable, is an extension of the courage she showed in that boardroom over 50 years ago. During the ceremony, the Sarah Harrison Memorial was inaugurated, a space dedicated to preserving her story and inspiring future generations. The memorial included a library with all her books and an exhibition room with personal items and historical documents. But the most moving part of the memorial was the letter room, where thousands of thank you letters sent by people impacted by her story were displayed. The letters came from every continent and were translated into dozens of languages. One letter that drew particular attention was from a 12-year-old girl from rural Alaska. "Dear Mrs. Sarah, my name is Hope and I live in a very small community near the river. My teacher told me your story and I wanted you to know that I want to be like you when I grow up. I don't want to be famous, I just want to have the courage to defend my family and my community the way you defended yours." Letters like this confirmed that Sarah's legacy had transcended generations and would continue to influence young people for decades. 15 years after Sarah's departure, her story had become a permanent part of the national culture. Schools across the country included her biography in the required curriculum, and her story was told in children's books, films, and plays. One especially popular adaptation was a soap opera produced by a television network that depicted not only Sarah's original struggle, but also the impact of her story in the following decades. The soap opera broke ratings records and was exported to over 40 countries. But perhaps the most touching tribute was a song composed by a young country singer who had grown up in a family of small farmers. The song, titled Rural Grit, became an unofficial anthem of the rural movements. From the field she came, to the field she returned, with books in hand and courage in her heart. She faced the powerful without fear of failing, showed that ordinary people can also win. Sarah, Sarah, your name is not forgotten. You planted hope where there was only sorrow. Sarah, Sarah, your fight lives on in every farmer who won't be intimidated. The song became the soundtrack for peaceful protests, graduations from rural courses, and swearing-in ceremonies for community leaders across the country. 20 years after Sarah's passing, the United States was recognized worldwide as a benchmark for protecting the rights of small rural producers. Delegations from dozens of countries regularly visited the country to learn about the American model of sustainable rural development. The Sarah Harrison Institute had become an international organization with offices in 15 countries. Its community empowerment methodology was studied at universities around the world and had been adapted to resolve conflicts in areas far beyond agriculture. Annie, now 60 years old and one of the world's leading experts on rural rights, wrote a book about the evolution of Sarah's legacy. What Sarah began as a personal struggle to save her property turned into a quiet revolution that changed the way the world sees the rights of small producers. Her method of combining technical knowledge, moral courage, and peaceful strategy became a replicable model in any context where there is an imbalance of power. Annie's book became required reading in international relations courses and was translated into more than 30 languages. 25 years after Sarah's passing, Mrs. Martha, now 122 years old, became one of the oldest people in the United States. Despite her exceptional age, she remained lucid and continued to be a living guardian of Sarah's memory. In a special interview marking her 122nd birthday, Mrs. Martha reflected deeply on her friendship with Sarah. "I have lived long enough to see 3 generations inspired by Sarah. My own great-grandchildren grew up hearing the stories I tell about her. It's incredible to think that a conversation on a porch between 2 simple women sparked a movement that changed the world." Mrs. Martha's interview was seen by millions of people and became a precious historical document about Sarah's personal life. Around the same time, Sophia, the young woman who had been inspired by Sarah's story to study law, was now 45 years old and had become Secretary of Agriculture of the United States. In her first speech as secretary, she made an emotional tribute. "I am the great-granddaughter of one of the families saved by Sarah Harrison. I grew up knowing that I owed my education and opportunities to the courage of a woman I never met personally, but who has always been my greatest inspiration. As secretary, I promised to keep defending the same values she defended: dignity, justice, and respect for small rural producers." Under Sophia's leadership, the United States launched the most ambitious rural development program in its history, directly benefiting more than 1 million families across the country. 30 years after Sarah's passing, a new discovery moved her admirers. During a renovation of the old farm, personal diaries that Sarah had written during the hardest years of her struggle were found. The diaries revealed Sarah's most human and vulnerable side, showing her doubts, fears, and moments of despair. But they also revealed the inner strength that sustained her throughout the journey. One particularly touching entry, written a few days after her first confrontation with Grant, read, "I'm still trembling with nervousness, but also with pride. For the first time in my life, I faced someone who tried to humiliate me, and I did not let myself be defeated. I don't know if I'll be able to save the farm, but I know I will never be the same person again. I discovered a strength within me that I didn't know existed. Maybe my parents were right when they said I was special." The diaries were published in a book that became a worldwide bestseller, offering a unique perspective on the formation of one of the most influential leaders of the 21st century. 40 years after Sarah's passing, the world had changed dramatically, but her influence remained strong. Rural issues were now treated with the same respect as urban issues, and the sustainable development model created in Brazil was widely adopted. A new generation of leaders who had grown up with Sarah's story as part of their basic education were taking up important positions around the world. These leaders carried with them the values of dignity, justice, and courage that Sarah had exemplified. Nathan, who had lived to be 105 years old, left a will that perfectly summed up his friend's legacy. Sarah Harrison proved that an ordinary person, armed only with knowledge, courage, and determination, can change the world. She wasn't born special. She became special through the choices she made. May her story continue to inspire future generations to make the right choices at the right moments. 50 years after Sarah's passing, her farm in Asheville had become an international pilgrimage site. People from all continents visited the place where it all began, seeking inspiration for their own struggles. Sarah's grave, which had become a national monument, received flowers daily from anonymous admirers. The original inscription had been supplemented with a phrase from her own writings: "True wealth lies not in what we possess, but in the good we do." Mrs. Martha had passed away at 128 years old, being the oldest person in Brazil's history until then. In her will, she left all her memories of Sarah recorded on video for future generations. 60 years after Sarah's passing, Brazil held a special ceremony to mark what would have been her 125th birthday. The country had become a world reference in rural social justice, and Sarah was widely recognized as the pioneer of this transformation. During the ceremony, a manifesto signed by leaders from around the world was read, acknowledging Sarah Harrison as one of the most influential figures of the 21st century. Sarah Harrison taught us that greatness is not measured by the power we wield over others, but by the service we render to humanity. Her life continues to inspire millions of people to fight for a fairer and more dignified world. 70 years after Sarah's passing, her influence had transcended any measure. Universities around the world offered courses on her legacy, and her methodology of peaceful resistance was studied as a model for social change. A global survey showed that 87% of people knew her story, and 72% cited her as an inspiration for their own lives. Sarah had become a universal symbol of courage, determination, and social justice. 80 years after Sarah's passing, in a special ceremony held at the United Nations headquarters, the creation of World Civic Courage Day was announced, celebrated annually on Sarah's birthday. The UN Secretary-General explained the choice. Sarah Harrison represents the best of humanity, the ability to transform adversity into opportunity, humiliation into dignity, apparent defeat into lasting victory. May her example continue to inspire citizens around the world to fight for their rights and the rights of others. 90 years after Sarah's passing, her original farm had become a university campus entirely dedicated to the study of sustainable rural development and social justice. Students from all over the world came to study at the Sarah Harrison campus, considered the global center of excellence in its field. The house where Sarah had lived was preserved exactly as she left it, serving as a museum and a source of inspiration for students. The porch where she had so often reflected on life remained a place of meditation and reflection. 100 years after Sarah's departure, the world had changed radically. Rural poverty had been virtually eliminated in most of the planet, and small farmers were respected and valued as fundamental pillars of society. Historians credited Sarah with the beginning of this transformation. Her example had inspired millions of people to organize, educate themselves, and fight for their rights peacefully but determinedly. In a special ceremony to mark the centenary of her passing, a statue of Sarah was unveiled at the United Nations headquarters. The statue portrayed her not as a majestic, heroic figure, but as an ordinary woman, holding a book in one hand and extending the other in a gesture of solidarity. The plaque at the base of the statue read simply, "Sarah Harrison, 1978-2063, proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things." During the ceremony, the UN Secretary-General gave a speech that perfectly summed up Sarah's legacy. 100 years ago, Sarah Harrison left this world, but her ideas, her methods, and above all her courage live on in every person who refuses to accept injustice, in every community that organizes to defend its rights, in every young person who chooses to fight for a better world. She taught us that we don't need to be perfect to make a difference. We only need the courage to start, the wisdom to learn, and the persistence to continue. Sarah Harrison began as a debt-ridden farmer, trying to save her land. She ended as one of the most influential figures in human history. May her journey continue to inspire all the ordinary people who carry within themselves the potential for extraordinariness. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of Sarah Harrison's story. Where are you watching us from? Do you believe an ordinary person can really make a difference like Sarah did? Leave your thoughts on courage, justice, and perseverance in the comments. We would love to read your opinion on this inspiring journey. Thank you very much for your company through this long story. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other emotional stories that show the power of human determination.